Bonjour, namaste, shalom. I'm pleased to welcome you to this conversation with Dr. Dinyar Patel, author of Naoroji, Pioneer of Indian Nationalism. This award-winning book, published by Harvard University Press, discusses the life and work of Dadabhai Naoroji, widely known as the Grand Old Man of India. In fact, in most Indian schools, we are taught that in our middle school, the Grand Old Man of India. Dinyar has a PhD in history from Harvard, was an assistant professor at University of South Carolina, and is now on the faculty at S.P. Jain Institute of Management Research in Mumbai. In my research on Dinyar, I was impressed by his willingness to speak and call a spade a spade. For example, in 2012, in a New York Times article, he very clearly pointed out that in India, history is literally rotting away, as historical documents are either disintegrating or being stolen because our national institutions are, and I quote him here, starved of funding, bereft of proper facilities and trained staff, and lacking proper security. Dr. Patel, thank you for taking the time to chat with us today about your book and the journey behind it.
Thank you very much, and please just call me Dinyar.
Thank you, Dinyar. And let me start with the first question that we ask everyone, 30 to 40-second elevator pitch of your book.
Yeah, so I think the best way to describe it is it's a book on someone who most people have never heard of. And if you're in India, you've probably heard of the individual, Dadabhai Naoroji, but you don't know much about him. And the main kind of pitch I would make about the book is it's someone you should probably know about, because a lot of ideas that global anti-colonialism was propelled by were developed or modified or influenced by Dadabhai Naoroji. And Naoroji was someone who did not just talk about the colonial influence of say British rule in a place like India. He kind of talked about colonialism and imperialism in a much broader vein. So in that sense, he's someone who he didn't have the same stature as, say, a Marx, or he's probably not even well known as J.A. Hobson, who was a famous kind of anti-colonial writer in the early 20th century. But he's someone whose writing can be read alongside people like that.
And what are 3 to 4 things you would want people to take away from this book?
So I think the most important thing to take away about the life of someone like Naoroji is just how globally connected it was. We tend to think of globalization as a relatively modern phenomenon. And obviously, since World War II, globalization has accelerated in ways and forms that it is difficult really to comprehend in earlier periods of time. But the life of someone like Naoroji is remarkably global. I mean, he is someone who grew up in a very, very poor family in Bombay, but relatively poor, I should say. I mean, Bombay obviously had pretty stark poverty in the early 19th century. Nevertheless, he was someone who, spent, nearly half his life in a foreign country, Great Britain, in the 19th century, and was prominent enough to actually be elected to the British Parliament in an era which was marked by stark racism. And someone who, he communicated with people around the world. Again, in an era of, when you don't have the advantage of something like, the internet or something, right? I mean, it took, weeks to communicate with people, but he managed it. So I think that's the most important thing. The other, important thing, I really emphasize in the book is, whenever you write a biography, you need to realize that the subject you write about, their views and ideas change. No one's ideas remain static, or at least, no really kind of consequential leader has ideas that remain static. And so one thing I really try to emphasize a lot in the book is how there's a progression, an intellectual progression, and how the ideas of this particular individual change and modify over time, and how that change influences the wider contours of Indian nationalism. And the third thing I guess I would say is kind of understanding what Indian nationalism was like, before the era of someone like a Gandhi or a Nehru. Most standard accounts we have of Indian nationalism concentrate, on the period from 1920 onward, and kind of write off the first few decades of Indian nationalism as a bit of a failure. I very much would like to correct that narrative. I mean, people like Gandhi himself said, look, the only way that we were able to achieve certain things is by the deeds of the people who came before us. I mean, kind of the theory of standing on the shoulder of giants, and Naoroji was one of them. He wasn't the only one by far, but early nationalism has much more, for it than has been commonly or popularly believed. It was much more diverse. It was much more consequential, and in some surprising ways, it was also much more popular than many historians have made it out to be.
And Dinyar, in the book, you call Naoroji the pioneer of Indian nationalism. That's a very strong claim, given that there were so many sort of giants, right? I mean, in overlapping or, in that era before Gandhi, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, Lala Lajpat Rai, so many of these giants. How do you sort of explain your claim?
It is a strong claim. The reason why I say it is because, as far as my research has shown, Naoroji was there first. Before Tilak was really, well known beyond, say, Pune. Naoroji was a household name in, political circles in India, not just in Bombay. I mean, he was really the first Indian nationalist who had a national standing. Someone like Tilak, of course, became tremendously popular, but that was a bit later on. Someone like Gokhale also became extremely consequential, but that was, very much, an early 20th century phenomenon. Naoroji was the first person to kind of enjoy wide, broad national support for the political program that, he put together. And it's quite remarkable when you travel around India. You see, I mean, I've been in some, old houses in Chennai, and they will have pictures of Naoroji. Why was a Gujarati-speaking Parsi from Bombay having pictures in, a place like Chennai? It's because, he kind of represented, he was the first kind of person to kind of represent India's national ambitions on a national scale. I mean, there were others, of course, in Bengal, but they were primarily, known only in Bengal. They had some receptivity across the rest of the country, but Naoroji was not just a Bombay person. He was a national figure, before any other figures like him enjoyed truly national reputations.
And was it sort of this, I don't want to say objective analysis, but was it this that drove you to focus on Naoroji? Was it the fact that he was a towering sort of, figure from the Parsi community to which you also belong? Or was it that you sort of, found something and that got you interested in Naoroji? What was it? So
the thing about research and history is that, you never really know what you're going to find out until you actually wade through the sources, the papers. This book started as my PhD dissertation. And, when I was in my PhD program in my first 2 or 3 years, I'd read some stuff on Naoroji. I mean, there's not a lot, but there's some stuff. And, that seemed to be the encapsulation of his life. But when you actually go and look at the private papers of an individual, and luckily Naoroji's papers survive. I mean, as we had talked about before the start of this conversation, in private, many figures in India, their private papers are long gone, destroyed, lost, thrown away, whatever. Luckily for Naoroji, those papers survive. I mean, they survive in a truncated form, but they're still there. So, when you go in as a historian into any archival collection, you are very much kind of an explorer, who has to quickly learn and pick up stuff on your journey. I mean, you just read a lot. So I had no clue really about the contours of Naoroji's life until I had gone through maybe around 10 to 15,000 papers in this collection, and only then did I really get a picture of, oh, this is what this person's life is like. This is what the significance is. So it's different. History is a bit different from other disciplines in the sense that, I mean, in another discipline, you might have like a controlled set of variables. You might have a controlled, area that you're looking at. In history, you do not know what you're getting into until you see the source material and then just spend like 1 or 2 years going through it.
And Dinyar, let me push this a little more though. I've done a PhD too, so I know what that journey is. It's not like you start a PhD program and the topic is given to you on a platter and you say, okay, now my job is to execute it. In fact, you have to come up with a topic in which, in your case, that was Naoroji. but how did you sort of get to saying, okay, the next 3 years of my life or X number of years of my life, I'm going to be researching about this obscure figure that, that maybe how did you actually get there?
Yeah. So, I was always interested in him as a figure. I mean, in college, I'd written one paper on him. And as you mentioned, I am a Parsi also. So, I mean, there was that interest that I had about him as a member of the same community that I was a part of. And the one thing that really interested me a lot when I was doing, my first 2 or 3 years of my PhD, when in history, all you do is you just read other people's writings, right? You read, the books and papers, and I'm sure, similar thing goes on in management. I was struck by how little had been written about him or other people in his generation, people like, say, Ranade or Gokhale. I mean, or how dated the scholarship was. I mean, there was a lot of scholarship written in the 1970s, but from the 1980s onward, people tend to kind of write off these figures and say they're not very consequential, they're not interesting, and move on and write about other people instead. So I was kind of shocked by how little interest and scholarship there was on these people. And South Asian history can be a very political and kind of theory-heavy field, and I think that oftentimes can be a bit of a detriment, for the studying of South Asia, because people tend to kind of get in very narrow topics of research or kind of confine their topics based on what is popular or fashionable, and someone like Naoroji or Ranade or Gokhale, they weren't fashionable. I mean, I had people in my PhD program saying, these are boring old men. Why would you want to study them? And I think such attitudes are not, very helpful. I mean, these people were important for, a particular reason. They had global consequences. I mean, not just Naoroji. I'm talking about many other people from this generation. And it's worth our while to kind of study them. And yeah, I mean, I took more time than maybe more people to study a particular individual, but I really enjoyed it. I mean, in at least the way the history PhD works in the US, as long as you can secure funding for research, you can research for, as long as you like. I mean, not maybe as long as you like, but you can research for 2-3 years. And I took 3 years to research.
And Dinyar, what you said resonated with me. Just last night, I was telling a friend who has been a friend for about 25 years that I'm thinking, after reading your book, to write a book about Lala Lajpat Rai, as I was also telling you. And his immediate response to me was, don't do it. So that sort of tells you, but
why did he tell you not to do it?
Well, for the same reasons that you mentioned, that era is gone, they are not relevant, why, who cares? And I had to sort of, say, put that aside, and then, I'll think about it in more depth later. But I'm sure sort of some of the same things you heard.
Yeah. I mean, these people are relevant. I mean, I mean, someone like Lala Lajpat Rai is relevant in so many ways, in the sense that, I mean, a lot of religious thought, was transmitted through him. People who bank with PNB here in India, Punjab National Bank, well, PNB, Rai was there. Rai was involved in Swadeshi activity. He was involved in Gandhian activities. So, I mean, these, and as we were talking about earlier on, he was also an international traveler, and he built up ties with African Americans and American anti-imperialists. So, I mean, in any other country, if you look at a Britain or a United States, there's a healthy interest in people like these, right? I mean, we have umpteen number of books in the United States on someone like Hamilton, right? Or a Madison, or a Monroe even, but we don't have comparative books on those figures in India. We have a lot on Gandhi. We have a lot on Nehru. Not many good books. I mean, we have some very good books in them, but most of the books that have been written on Gandhi and Nehru is not terribly great. But the other people, it's like you fall off a cliff. I mean, you have some books on people like Tilak and such. Oftentimes that can be very politically motivated, but you don't have the same depth and breadth of scholarship that you do in, say, the British historical environment or the American or the French or, whatever.
And I think we need it if India is to sort of become a paramount power, which seems to be of interest to many people these days, right? That India sort of is considered in the ranks of the leading nations in the world.
I think any country needs to just do a good job of making sure that all aspects of its history are covered. And in India, you've tended to have a few towering figures. And now, I mean, some of them are towering for a reason. I mean, people like Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar are towering because they just had really consequential effects on Indian society. But they themselves acknowledge that there are many other people out there who are doing a lot of stuff on the ground, without which they could not do their own things. And any society, regardless, big, small, in terms of country's population or economic heft, to get a really well-rounded picture of your history, you need to go beyond those particular 1, 2, 3 individuals and see who else is out there.
And you put it very well early on when you said, these people were standing on the shoulders of giants who came before them. And so, that I think is important too. Now, one of the things I learned from your book, and I had to admit that I did not know about this at all, was drain theory. Can you explain what Naoroji was talking about when he connected poverty in India to the, quote, the drain of wealth from India?
Sure. So, this is probably the most famous idea that's associated with Naoroji. And the idea is essentially that British colonialism was draining the wealth of India. Now, I mean, by the time Naoroji started writing about the economics in India, the economic situation in India, which is the late 1860s, many people in India had come to the belief that India was growing poorer under British colonialism. Now, the official line that the British government would give, both in India and abroad, was that India was actually becoming richer. Thanks to colonial rule. So there was this disparity. I mean, people in India thought they were getting poorer. The officials actually said, no, they're getting richer. We're bringing railways, irrigation, infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. And so what Naoroji did is, compile data that demonstrated, in his capacity that, no, actually India was very poor and that it was growing poorer every year. And the idea that he specifically faceted on was that every year, a certain amount of tax revenue was literally taken out of the country and sent back to Great Britain. And his estimates on that amount varied over time. But he said at one point that as much as 1/4 of all tax revenue collected in India and in a given year was physically taken out of the country and the economy and sent to Great Britain. This was not a new idea, the idea of the drain theory. I mean, Naoroji is associated with it because he just wrote a lot about it and he popularized it. But historians have talked about how Indians were observing this impoverishment and this literal draining out of resources as early as the 1770s and 1780s in Bengal. Right after the British started to take control of Bengal and received the right of Diwani from the Mughals. So a legacy of impoverishment was, again, I mean, we were talking about this idea of standing on the shoulder of giants. Naoroji himself received this idea from previous generations. I mean, so when he was, studying in Bombay in Elphinstone College in the 1840s, there were actually a group of Maharashtrian intellectuals who were talking about this, that India is growing poorer and, they might have not used the term drain itself, but they alluded to this idea that wealth was being taken out, resources were being taken out of the country. And Naoroji listened to these guys and attended their meetings and heard what they said. And actually, the first speech that Naoroji gives on the drain theory, he says, I remember a time when, I was a student and I listened to Maharashtrian intellectuals. So he kind of, paid his debts to this early generation. So the idea of a drain of wealth, was multi-generational in India. And of course, later on, after Naoroji, it's continued by people like Gandhi and Nehru. I mean, Gandhi, of course, builds up Indian nationalism on the premise that India had become starkly poor and that poverty was the result of, deliberate British policy. So it carries on. And, as I mentioned in the book also, it has international, parallels as well. I mean, other countries that experience colonialism oftentimes, came up with similar arguments or were influenced by the arguments that Naoroji and others made to talk about the impoverishing legacies of colonial rule.
And what is the status of drain theory today among scholars of colonialism and imperialism?
Yeah, it really depends on what side of the political spectrum you're on. So there are, Marxist scholars or very left scholars, economists, people like Utsa Patnaik, who've calculated the drain, as high as I think $45 trillion. So some scholars say that yes, it took place. It was very large in numbers. Those more on the right or non-left, I should say, have actually said no, it's not as bad as it was, or have discounted it altogether. I'm in my book, I'm less interested in whether this argument is right or wrong. I'm interested in how the argument was used to propel a political theory. So I don't really take a side on it. But there is a lot to be said on both sides. Were in some cases estimates of the drain of wealth exaggerated? Perhaps. There has been some political science work which has talked about how railways might have increased levels of wealth in certain parts of India, and a lot of Indians, from the 1870s onwards, argues that no, actually railways actually impoverished India. But there is certainly a lot of evidence that British colonialism did impoverish India. I mean, there's no way to escape it. I'm working on a paper on early Swadeshi in India in the 19th century, and at least the evidence that's put out there, the written evidence of people going out into the countryside and observing impoverishment, is stunning. People observed it. It's very hard to quantify it, and maybe it was cumulatively and on a gross level, maybe it wasn't as bad as many people made it out to be. But it's really, I think it's really hard to dispute that something was quite wrong in the state of Denmark, or the state of India in this case, in the 19th century economically. Yeah.
So the thought that crossed my mind when I read about this in your book, and you have a whole chapter sort of about this, and I encourage everyone to read that, to be honest, regardless of which side of the political spectrum they are. But when I read this, one thought that crossed my mind was, there's all this sort of trend, practice going around the world these days in terms of reparations, whether it's Germany and the Jewish people. In the US, we are now hearing about reparation. There's all this debate about reparations for Black people who were enslaved, as you're well aware, growing up here. Does drain theory lead us to reparations from the British to the Indians or other former colonies?
So a few years ago, as you might be aware, Shashi Tharoor took part in a debate at the Oxford Union where there was a debate on whether reparations should be offered. And he said, we just want an apology. Maybe you can give up £1 as a symbolic form of reparations. So, you're right. This idea of impoverishment under colonialism and debate about reparations, there is a strong link between the two. And Naoroji himself actually articulated it. In his last real year of political activity in 1906, when he was, about 81 years old, he actually wrote to the British Prime Minister and said, the crimes that have been committed under British rule, i.e. impoverishment, deserve a form of reparations, and that reparations should be self-government. So he didn't classify reparations as being a monetary amount. He said the reparation that you must give us is our freedom. So even in this early era, there were discussions about how reparations should fit into the figure over here.
And you mentioned 1906 when he was 81 years old, but that was also the year he was president of the Indian National Congress at that time. So Correct. He was active well into his 80s, or that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, he was politically active until his 81st year. He was someone who, in many ways refused to slow down until health finally caught up with him. After in the year 1907, so after he returns from the Calcutta Congress, having been the president of the International Congress in 1906, then his health really just gave way. And doctors actually told him, look, if you continue with this way, you're going to kill yourself. So he retired at that point in time.
I wonder if the health was affected in part by all this split between the extremists and the moderates in the Indian National Congress, and how volatile the situation had become at that time. Any observations on that, or was it just age?
So I think it was a lot to do with age, and it was a lot to do also with just the pollution of London. So Naoroji lived in London, as I mentioned, for pretty much half his life. And between the years 1886 and 1906, so a number of decades, he lived in London pretty much all the time. And London then was terribly polluted, right? It was kind of like Delhi or Mumbai today. People burned coal and wood, and the Thames was as smelly as the Yamuna or the Arabian Sea is today. So it was a filthy, terrible place to be in. And he suffered from a lot of pulmonary ailments, bronchitis and stuff like that. So I think that was really the thing that got to him. I mean, he had to physically move to different places in London because of his health issues. So when you're a historian, you look through the archives, you see everything, right? So I would see notes from doctors, a correspondence with Naoroji would talk about his health problems. And they're quite serious. The man was giving several speeches a day, and whenever you're doing that, you aggravate your vocal cords. You cause yourself to be at risk for health. And many of Naoroji's allies actually told him, look, slow down or stop doing this because you're going to really impair your health. And we have to remember also this was an era before loudspeakers. So if you are talking to a group of 1,000 people, the only way you can talk to them is for them to all be quiet, which won't be the case, and for you to really speak loudly. And if you're 80 years old, how are you going to do this, right, without causing some sort of health problem?
Yeah, that's a good observation. Now, in the book on page 257, you make a very interesting observation, and I chuckled when I read that. And you said, I quote, of the many roles Dadabhai Naoroji pioneered in the Indian nationalist movement, one was, unfortunately, that of the absent husband and father. Please explain why you say that.
So I think this is a common theme amongst Indian nationalists or political figures from this generation in general. So, Gandhi is the classic case, right? Gandhi is regarded as someone who is not a very good husband, and not a very good father, especially to people like Harilal. He was someone who put his work first. Nehru, to a certain degree, you can say the same thing. Of course, Nehru was behind bars for 16 years, so it wasn't entirely his fault. I'm reading a biography of Ambedkar right now, and Ambedkar's wife made the same complaints, for 7-8 years, while Ambedkar's wife is literally making cow dung patties to keep the family going. Ambedkar is studying in Columbia University in London, and Naoroji was the same. Naoroji was the same, exactly the same way. He went and spent several decades of his life in London, and occasionally he took his family members there, and occasionally once he took his wife there, but by and large he did not. So the family was largely left to itself. There were financial arrangements and family members would look in, but there were signs that I found in the correspondence that a lot of family members were deeply unhappy with this. Naoroji's wife was illiterate, so we don't have any written evidence from her, but there is correspondence which shows that she was quite angry at being left by herself, right? Especially if you're a woman in the 1880s, right? In a deeply conservative, patriarchal society, if your husband's not there, how do you cope? And Naoroji's children also definitely resented, the absence. It got so bad to the sense that one of Naoroji's daughters, pleaded with Naoroji to return for her own wedding, and Naoroji said, "Sorry, I can't. I have to, stand for election to parliament instead." So yeah, this is one thing we can definitely criticize Naoroji and many other Indian nationalists for. I think any political leader kind of faces this conundrum. How do you balance your political responsibilities with your family? But Indian politicians were quite bad at that balancing act. They really put all the cards on one side of the table.
And when I read this book, one thing that struck me was when Naoroji, for example, was in England, family members, including his son, would pass away.
Yeah.
And you can't be there for that. I'd never sort of thought about that aspect of traveling back then. Was that something you found surprising, or did you already knew about that?
The ability of us today to go halfway around the world when something good or bad happens is remarkable, right? I'm in Mumbai, but if something good or bad were to happen to my family members in the United States, I could get on a plane tonight and be there tomorrow. Prior to the development of really fast airline transportation, you did not have that option, right? Your ability to travel was oftentimes, if you were rich, maybe a few days. If you were, somewhat rich, a few weeks. If you were the vast majority of people in the world, there was no opportunity to travel, right? I mean, you got a telegram that said so-and-so passed away, and that was it. And I encountered many such telegrams while researching. You're saying that, a cousin had passed away in Great Britain or India, or in this case, Naoroji's own son passed away in Kutch while Naoroji was in London. And Naoroji could not go back to India. He actually physically could not, because he was in parliament at the time and he was already planning to go to India in a month. And it, in any case, took several weeks to travel to India. So, what do you do, right? I mean, it's quite a scary thing to think. I mean, there was an era where people literally received a telegram saying, so-and-so has passed away, and there was nothing you could do, right? I mean, the only thing you could really do is look around your friend circle, if you were, in a different part of the world, seek consolation amongst them. But, there was no closure for many of these people.
Yeah. Now, in your book, as I read your book, I realized that even though Naoroji spent more than 20 years of his life in England, right, he remained an Indian at heart. And that was very, in some ways, I mean, you don't think about this, but as an immigrant living in the US these days, for the last 20 years, I mean, you see sort of that is not the case for many people, right? And back then, of course, communication was much less, and information exchange was much less. Why do you think it happened that he remained an Indian at heart, and in everyday life too, right? His practice, his clothing, his so many things. Why, in his case, did that happen?
So Naoroji was one of several political figures who went to Great Britain specifically for political reasons, specifically for advancing the political agenda in India. So I mean, I'm sure he enjoyed his time being there. I'm not questioning that, but it's not like he went there deliberately to settle in another place. I mean, he always knew that he wanted to go back, and the ambition of being in Great Britain was just to be at the center of imperial power, so that he could influence events back home in India. So even though his feet were on the ground in Great Britain, his mind was always in India. But he was not the only one who did this. I mean, there were many other people who did this as well. I mean, Ramesh Chandra Dutt spent several years in London, to kind of compile research that would make a very strong articulation of this idea that India had been impoverished by British rule. There were others who kind of acclimatized more to life in Great Britain, and yes, did settle down. I mean, W.C. Banerjee, who's the founder of the Indian National Congress, is kind of a classic case. I mean, he was an Indian patriot, but by the 1880s or so, he had accustomed himself, and his family members had accustomed himself as well to life in Great Britain. And so, they, deliberately would wear English clothing. Several of Banerjee's family members converted to Christianity. So the bonds of culture and religion and culture and nationality were loosened in those cases. In the case of Naoroji, there was no ambition to settle in a different place. The ambition was always to come back.
And that wasn't most natural, right? You use the example of W.C. Banerjee, but in the book you also talk about these other people whose parents would send Naoroji letters saying, my son, and in later years daughter is in England to study, but they seem to have fallen in love with local people or whatever. Can you keep an eye on them? Can you help? I mean, so there was, so in your sort of research, did you find that it was more common for people to retain the Indianness at heart and in mind, or was it more common for them to sort of assimilate?
Yeah, it was just much more difficult to integrate and assimilate in this era, because this was an era of pretty sharp racial divisions. And I mean, the other thing to remember, I mean, I know it can seem incredible today, is there were just very few Indians in London, right? I mean, today you go to London and, every second person is from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or Nepal. In that era, the community was obviously much smaller. And if you were outside of London, in another city in Great Britain, you oftentimes faced pretty stark racism. And also the way that, finances worked, meant that it was very, very difficult to settle in Great Britain. I mean, if you were receiving money from parents or benefactors in India, that money did not go far in Great Britain. Unless you got a job, a stable job, which was very difficult to do, it was very hard to continue with life on a permanent basis in a place like Great Britain, and it was even more difficult in other places like the United States, right? Because in the United States, at least by the early 20th century, you could not get citizenship. The Supreme Court had ruled that you were not eligible for citizenship, so you are at the mercy of immigration officers. And when you study the lives of not Naoroji but other people who were involved in the nationalist movement in places like the United States in the 1920s and 1930s and 40s, their life is very tenuous, right? You are in America today, but you could not be tomorrow, depending on how American and British immigration authorities treated you. So it's an era where it's much more difficult to be a global Indian.
So in your book, you talk about Naoroji as an Indian emissary, a scholar, a crusader against racism, and a community leader for an emerging British Indian diaspora. In the book, you also talk about Naoroji's entrepreneurial ventures, Naoroji as a professor, his leadership of the Indian National Congress, and his efforts at institution building. Seems a lot for one person. It seems almost superhuman. Did you expect to find all this?
No, I didn't. Maybe one reason he was so productive is because he didn't have the internet before all of us were, distracted by funny cat videos and such. But yeah, this is one of the things which, really shows how archival research changes one's perspectives on people. So, I didn't know any of the stuff before coming in to work with Naoroji's papers, that, he had particular business ventures, or that, he had a particular community role within the British Indian community. And you really only find that out by going through every single document and kind of seeing what's going on and how people regarded him as a leader or as a figure. And some of the finds were quite surprising. In the 1890s, when Naoroji was in his 60s, he's serving as, vice president for cricket clubs in London. What is a 60-year-old man doing as, the leader of a cricket club in London? Some of the cricket clubs were Indian, but some were not. Some were British. And all of this shows that, sociologists like Robert Putnam have written about how associational life in America has dwindled, right? People bowl alone. There's that famous book he wrote, Bowling Alone. And, that has caused kind of, the bonds of democracy and social cohesion to wither away. And when you research a figure like Naoroji, you realize just how strong some of these associational bonds were in the 19th century. If you're in a place like London or even a place like Bombay, people just were part of so many different things. You could be a businessman, but you could also be a part of a scientific society. You could be a part of an anti-racist organization. You could be a part of a feminist organization. You could be part of a prohibition, campaigning organization. You had your church or, religious affiliations. You had XYZ. So institutional life in this era was thick. And Naoroji his life, the institutional affiliations for Naoroji were extremely thick. And, in many ways kind of uniquely thick, but, his peers had very thick institutional lives as well, which is very different from our lives today.
Yeah, it's amazing how much our life today is more in silos, and they seem to be doing a lot more across different areas. So
absolutely, yeah, it was an era marked by less specialization, which is both good and bad, right? The good thing was that, again, you could join whatever organization, or you could be a big part of a movement which you might not have much expertise in, just because those doors were open to you.
Right. Now, on page 10 of the book is what I think is where you make, in my view, the strongest sort of claim, the most provocative argument, if you will, of the book. And it's not about Naoroji in particular, it's a more general argument. You say Marxist and post-colonial traditions still dominate the academy, and scholars of South Asia trained in this tradition, and I quote, have almost reflexively shunned political elites. Can you explain why this is the case? And do you see any changes?
The good news is that I think there has been a lot of change, especially since I wrote that. I mean, in the past few years, there have been a number of biographies that have come out, and even people who I knew of who were quite anti-biography are now themselves writing biographies. So it's been quite a remarkable change. But South Asian academia, especially things like history, they've been very political spaces, and there have been spaces that oftentimes have been dominated by certain theories or certain perspectives. And Marxist traditions and post-colonialism in general has had a very, very strong hold over the academy for South Asian history. And there's some good to that, right? I mean, there's understandable good to that, because you need those perspectives to understand a place like India, where ideas of economic and social stratification are so strong. But oftentimes those perspectives have crowded out all other perspectives. And so that was really my problem with a lot of academia when I experienced it as a graduate student, that, at least amongst a lot of people, say maybe 10 years ago or so, the idea of studying a political elite was considered unfashionable because somehow these elites were bad or in some cases boring or inconsequential. And, in South Asian studies, there was a big movement called subaltern studies, which is the idea that, we need to study the voices of people who are not elites, which is good, right? I mean, it's a good thing. But the unfortunate consequence is that people only concentrated on that and left everyone else out of the picture, which I think is problematic. And I think, again, in the past few years, stuff has changed. There've been some healthy developments. But my main reason for writing a book about someone like Naoroji is that, is basically that, people like him have been neglected for a long time, have been kind of written off, sometimes have been written off in a very uncharitable way. And, a lot of Marxists or communists in the 1940s and 50s regarded people like him and others like him to be, basically colonial stooges. And that's clearly not the case. I mean, yes, these people did not have as advanced nationalist views as, say, a Gandhi or a Nehru, but they were also, 30 to 40 years before those individuals, and their views were important in their own time and were radical in some aspects for their own time as well. So that is, the nuance that I would like to at least bring to this debate. You can't just, cut these people out just because they might be elites, because they might, be dealing in high politics. Their lives had consequence, and their voices need to be heard as well.
And on the issue of, their views may not have been sort of as strong as Gandhi's or Nehru's, which you just brought up. I was reading a biography of George Washington recently, and there's been tons of books on him. But one of them brought up a really good point, that in his early correspondence, he does not talk about independence from Britain. He talks about more autonomy from Britain, which got me thinking that's sort of how this evolved in India as well.
Absolutely.
Our criticism of the early leaders in India seems a little unfair when that's the ground of criticism.
Absolutely. I mean, many American elites were very pro-British. Only 10 years before, things started to heat up. They celebrated the end of the wars with France. The conflict that raged everywhere from Quebec down to the Appalachians in North America. They were very pro-British at one point in time, but things change, right? People change, times change, circumstances change, and we need to chronicle that change as well.
So now on this issue of sort of shunning of elite in the Marxist post-colonial tradition, Sanjeev Sanyal, who's become a popular historian in India, he's written several popular books, recently made the claim that the professional historian is so constrained by the existing theories in their training that we cannot expect them to be able to step out of the existing theories and be able to sort of challenge those. Kind of what you've done, to be honest, with your book, right? On Naoroji, you challenge the post-colonial Marxist sort of outlook on Indian freedom struggle. Having gone through a PhD program yourself, Do you think his claim has merit that PhD programs are good at indoctrination? So if we want people to take a different look at the Indian freedom struggle, it's not going to come from people who are in, professional historians?
I'm not familiar with Sanyal, but I disagree with his. I mean, that sounds like a very broad brush characterization. Academia is obviously not about indoctrination. It's very much about healthy debate and contention of ideas. And just the very fact that in the past few years, you have seen such a remarkable amount of work on biography and intellectual history coming out of South Asia is testament to that fact that it's not monolithic. It's constantly changing. That attitude strikes me as being a little dangerous. We can't write off professional historians in block. Yes, there are some people whose views you might not agree with, but that's the purpose of academia, right? Healthy debate and discussion. There are many academics whose views I strongly disagree with, but I respect them tremendously, and I rely on their work every day because they bring a different debate to a different perspective to our debates. So, I mean, that perspective sounds remarkably like kind of the woke arguments you see in America, in the sense of broad brush, kind of cancel everyone, and I'm very much against that. I have many colleagues in academia who agree with my perspective and many who disagree with my perspectives, and that debate needs to continue, and both sides need to come out. And professional academia is where a lot of that debate needs to take place. I mean, there is a role, obviously, for popular historians, absolutely, but we are not in the business of indoctrination or ideology. We are in the business of thorough research and kind of vetting arguments and modifying our thoughts and arguments based on what we regard as what the documentary trail of evidence shows. We're not interested in indoctrination at all.
And we try to tell the PhD students even here, right? Do your research and then let the chips fall where they fall. But it's not about indoctrination and ideology. It's about research and what your scholarship says. So let me move to the next question, though. What kind of research did you do in writing this book? A lot of sort of lay people think that these days research means getting on the internet, Googling, and then sort of copying, pasting from the web. I'm assuming that's not what you did. And, of course, you described that in more detail. But what did you do?
Yeah. So, picking up on that idea, the one thing that I think the pandemic taught me is that there is now just so much out there on the internet, a lot of it behind paywalls, of course, but even, on something like archive.org, you can do some pretty comprehensive research now without stepping into an archive. Now, I'm not saying I would recommend that because archives are indispensable, but I'm saying that in a situation like a pandemic where those archives are closed, you can do stuff. It's not going to be the same level of what you could do with an archive, but you can do a substantial amount of stuff. And every year, more stuff is being put online that is making it easier to do research from home. Now, the reason why I say that you still have to go to an archive is that it is just physically impossible to scan everything that's there. Any archive will have literally millions of documents. And maybe there will be a point in time when most of that stuff is online, but it'll take a long time. And in that intervening amount of time, more documents will have come, right? Because people are still writing stuff on paper. Paper trails haven't disappeared. So what I did, is, as I said, I spent 3 years researching on Naoroji, and I spent roughly 2 of those years in Delhi working with Dadabhai Naoroji's personal papers. So, before the age of when everyone had computers, you'd keep your physical correspondence, right? I have a box at home where, I keep, I still had correspondence or have correspondence with some people. So I keep my own thing over here. And obviously before the internet and before the mass penetration of email, everyone would do that of consequence. So Naoroji amassed a collection of probably maybe 60,000 documents by the time that he passed away in 1917. And those 60,000 documents were kept in a godown in Bombay and later transferred to places like Pune and eventually to Delhi. And in that intervening time, a lot of stuff was lost. About half the collection probably was lost. But half of it is still there. And so what I did, starting in the first year of my research, is I just basically started with the first document, and I tried to go as far as possible in a collection of 30,000 documents, and I got through about 15,000. So I mean, I didn't get through even half of the amount of documents in this collection because the collection is so vast. But there comes a point where you've seen enough that you get an idea. It's kind of like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. The more weeks and months you put in, the more pieces of a jigsaw puzzle you can put down on the table to reassemble this person's life. And private correspondence gives a fantastic window into a person's life that you cannot get from published sources. So, a Gandhi, a Nehru, a Naoroji, an Ambedkar, they will publish lots of stuff, right? But what you see in private correspondence oftentimes represents a very different idea and ideology. Because, obviously, if you're in a colonial setting like India, what you say in public has to be moderated, right? It has to be a bit more temperate than what you might actually feel in person. And this was, I think, the biggest lesson that I learned doing archival research. I mean, I know of many people who've done research on figures from the 19th century who look exclusively at their writings. A figure like Bairamji Malabari. Not many people know about him today, but he was an important social reformer and writer in Bombay. And a lot of people would, completely classify him as a social reformer, and that's it. And if you actually go into the archives, and Malbari doesn't have his own collection, but 200 of his letters survive in Naoroji's papers, you realize this figure is also a very active political figure, which is not something that you'll ever get from just reading the guy's published writings. This man was thoroughly connected with political leaders in Bombay and the princely states in Gujarat and British politicians. And even though he resigned the Congress in 1886, he was still very much kind of supporting it behind the scenes. So there's a lot more you can learn about an individual by reading their private papers, and that you can't get on the internet by and large. I mean, you can to a certain degree. The British Library and such have digitized a lot of private papers, but you still have to go to an archive. And the only way you can really comprehensively learn about a person is by basically just patiently sifting through thousands of documents.
So you describe in the book many anecdotes about Naoroji, the struggle to find, quote, tasty food in England, his wearing of the pink trousers, and his comparing of sugar cultivation in, sugar production in Delhi versus Ludhiana. What's your favorite anecdote of Naoroji from the book?
There are a lot. I mean, I'll mention two. I mean, the one thing I found most interesting was just how often and in different ways that Naoroji's name was mispronounced and butchered in Great Britain. I actually started to keep a list of the way that his names were misspelled, because I'm sure you, like me, can relate to how our names are butchered in a foreign context, right? I mean, I grew up in the US, and my name was, I was called everything from Danois to Dinner to Dinyar to God knows whatever. So I could really relate to that. So that was one fun thing that I noticed. And the other thing that I think really humanized Naoroji for me was, and I mentioned this in the book. So as I told you, Naoroji was kind of a father-like figure for Indians living in Great Britain, especially students, who came to Great Britain to study at, say, an Oxford, Cambridge, or engineering colleges, and really were immersed in a completely unfamiliar environment and looked up to him to kind of, for guidance, financial and cultural and whatever. And, in the 1890s, Naoroji received a telegram at home at around 2 o'clock in the morning from a police station in London saying, there's an Indian, we've arrested him, he's drunk, it was just after New Year's Day, and he's asked you to bail him out. I mean, I found this particularly funny because, I don't even know if this Indian knew who Naoroji was, or vice versa. But Naoroji's reputation was such that he was recognized as kind of an authoritative figure. And so when this poor individual who was caught, inebriated on the streets of London, when he was asked for someone to bail him out, he turned to Naoroji.
And he was willing to help, is the sense I get from your book.
I honestly don't know.
In general, he was willing to help people.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. In this particular case, there's no paper trail that shows what happened afterward, but, perhaps he intervened, perhaps he just kept on sleeping.
And one episode about Naoroji that did not make it to the book.
There's a lot. I mean, The one advantage of doing 3 years of research is that only a tiny fraction of the research you do actually gets into the book. So I have, probably hundreds of pages of material which I haven't used. So, one thing that I'll show you how I'm using one thing right now. I'm looking a lot at Naoroji's business activities and how they fit in with economic activity in London, not in London, in places like Bombay and Western India in the late 19th century. So Naoroji was, in charge of his own business in London that was involved in the cotton trade. And one thing he did also was help, businesses in Bombay purchase machinery and, goods for industrial attempts in India, kind of proto-Swadeshi activity. So, in the I think the late 1850s, or no, I think it must have been the early 1860s, Naoroji helped a group of Bombay industrialists buy a ship that was used to trade between Bombay and ports in East Asia. Around the same time, he helped Ranchhodlal Chotalal, the father of Ahmedabad's cotton industry, modern cotton textile industry, purchase machinery for setting up the first textile mill in Ahmedabad. So, he played multiple roles, and those multiple roles, it's impossible to describe them in a 200-page book. But one thing I've found useful is through writing separate articles. I've written several articles that kind of have spun out from this book. One article on his relationship with a Maharashtrian inventor who invented revolutionary typewriting technology. I wrote another paper on Dadabhai Naoroji's granddaughter, who actually became a staunch supporter of Gandhi and actually went out into the NWFP and tried to promote ahimsa amongst people there. And this other paper on Swadeshi. The one fun thing is that, even though you do a lot of research and you can't use all of it for your book, you'll find use for it as you know, right? You'll find use for it in the rest of your academic career.
Right. And for those of the listeners in the future who may not know what NWFP is, that's the Northwest Frontier Province, I assume?
Correct, yeah.
So in reviewing your book for the Wall Street Journal, Tunku Varadarajan writes that this pioneer of Indian nationalism is almost entirely forgotten in India. You are of Indian origin. You grew up in the US, but you're now working in India. Do you agree with Varadarajan's observation?
Absolutely. And it's not just him. Many other people are forgotten from this era. If we look at the pre-Gandhian era, probably the tallest tree right now is Tilak, right? But Tilak himself acknowledged that he was one of many individuals, right? Tilak and Gokhale were, fighting for influence in so many ways, and Gokhale today is not forgotten, but his memory is a shadow of what it should be in many ways. He was a pretty incredible individual on many levels. Many people have just forgotten this particular generation. And one thing I really try to do in my scholarship is say, that there are reasons for why we should actually study these individuals, because their ideas were actually pretty dynamic and unique. And the ideological foundations that they brought to the table for creating modern India continue to have resonance today.
So before I ask you my next question, let me remind the few people who are on the call that they're welcome to ask questions anytime they want by Zoom, by raising their hand in Zoom, or by clicking on the video option. But let me ask you this. You teach at a premier institution in Mumbai. Do you find that your students have forgotten these people?
So I teach a very diverse set of students. I teach a lot of MBA students who obviously don't have a history background, right? I kind of introduce them to the very basics. And so many of the students there, if I talk about Naoroji, they say much the same thing of what I talk about in the book. We've heard about him. We read a little bit about him, in grade whatever, right? But that's it. We don't know much more about him. If you talk to students who have a much stronger background, like I'd say the PhD level on economic history and kind of, the history of the freedom movement, they'll know a bit more. But in general, knowledge of these individuals is not strong. Knowledge of these individuals is not very strong across the board, even if we look at international academia. where there is obviously much more specialized knowledge on these people. But I mean, take a figure like Ranade. Ranade is a fascinating figure. I mean, the more I read about him right now, the more I'm just amazed at his ideas, whether it's social reform or economic activity. And the last really good book on him was written in 1975, I think, which is a shame because I mean, there's a reason also why not many people have written about him, because a lot of his papers have been lost. But there's still work that could be done on him. So, I mean, similar with a person like Lala Lajpat Rai, right? I mean, he is phenomenally influential in his own ways. But for some reason in India, we tend to kind of remember or deify only a few figures without remembering kind of the panoply of individuals who, were part and parcel of the movement. I mean, you can think of the independence struggle as kind of like a machine, right? And you take out a few gears and the machine doesn't work as well, it doesn't work at all. And the machine of Indian nationalism was massive, right? It had to be massive, right? It took place on a subcontinental scale. It took place in several languages. It took place across several continents, right? I mean, nationalists were based in New York, Berlin, South Africa, London, Shanghai, Tokyo. So, it was a diverse panoply of people. And we need to remember that, there's so many thousands of people which we need to factor in when we think of something like the freedom movement.
And I truly hope that books like yours will help motivate for further interest in this area, encourage other people to read and research in this area. And that's the sense I get from your book, is what you want to see as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
So let's move towards the
go ahead. Yeah.
Last part of this conversation, because we are about past time, and we do want to stay within time. Who are the writers who inspired you when you were getting into the PhD program or thinking about making writing your career? Who was your inspiration?
So, I was one of those people who kind of did a history PhD without much background in history. So I kind of walked in without really knowing much of what was going on. And I kind of picked it up as, I had no intention to be an academic. I actually was planning to go into kind of like policy. I had no intention to become an academic. But as you probably know also, having gone through a PhD, you're sucked in, and here we are. So, I mean, the people who really inspired me a lot were people like Ramchandra Guha. The ability for him to just write on so many different diverse topics and also write biographies. I mean, one of Guha's earliest books was on Verrier Elwin, and it's a fantastic book. And it's really a riveting, engaging account of not just a man, but using a man to kind of talk about broader issues, the issue of Adivasis in India, and how they were treated, not just by the British, but by ordinary Indians, right? I mean, so if you want to get an idea of how Adivasis were marginalized politically, you read this biography and you get a very good idea of it. Other people who I met in graduate school, one of my readers was Maya Jasanoff, who is a professor of British history. And the thing I really respect about her is that she writes in a very crisp, clear manner that's accessible. A lot of us academics in history, we write to a specialized audience. And a lot of what we write is pretty bad. It's not very well written. And Jasanoff wrote books that won awards for their accessibility. Anyone could read them, and they were interesting and engaging. And that really inspired me also to try to make the story interesting, not dry and dull as dust. Others like Sven Beckert, he was another one of my readers. He was someone who really made me think much more about economic history and the history of capitalism. And these were topics which, at least I began my PhD thinking, were a little bit dull and dry. My own bias and my mistake. And from having been a TA for one of his classes and having read his book on the history of cotton, which is really remarkable, I changed my opinions. I think again, for all of us in academia, we tend to identify more people as we go along, who really kind of inspire you to be the writer you are, the researcher you are. So I mean, one other individual who I've been reading a lot of recently is Linda Colley, who's a historian in Princeton. And I actually just was in Princeton last month. She had invited me over there, but to speak. But I mean, she'd written a history of constitutions recently. And on the surface, constitutions might seem as another rather dull, dry thing. But she wrote it in such a way that the story really leaps off the page. And she talks about how constitutions, the spread of global constitutions tells about so much more. The development of certain modern political cultures, the role of warfare in the creation of modernity, the use of the constitutions had to kind of push back against European imperialism. It's a remarkable book. And the other books she's written are equally good. I mean, the most famous book she's written, probably, arguably, is a book on Great Britain, Britain's Forging the Nation, which gives a really new and unique perspective on how a country like Great Britain, which didn't exist 300 years ago, was forged.
And what book are you reading? What books are you reading these days?
So I just finished a book by Ulbe Bosma, who is a Dutch historian and sociologist on the history of sugar. So it's kind of, Sven Beckert had written this book on the history of cotton. This is kind of the book version of sugar. And it's really amazing to see how globalized sugar is as a commodity. I mean, sugar is obviously something all of us use every day, right? I mean, just before coming on this podcast, I had my cup of tea with, the requisite teaspoon of sugar. And he really shows how this commodity drove capitalism, not only of the past 200 years, but really over the past 500, 700 years, and how a lot of the capitalism emerged in a place like India, in places like Bengal and northern India. So that's one book that I've recently read. I'm currently reading a new biography on Ambedkar by someone called Ashok Gopal, which is very good. It's long; it's 800 pages, but it's written well enough that you speed through it. And Ambedkar is someone who I don't know enough about, and reading the book, I realize, just how ignorant I am about the issues that Ambedkar fought for. And as a historian, I'm a little embarrassed by how little I know about the world that he inhabited. So it's really been a remarkable book to read. The other book I read recently was by, I'm going to butcher her name, someone called Leah Yipi, an Albanian political scientist at the London School of Economics. And she's written a book called Free, which is kind of an autobiography of her life growing up in Albania at the end of Enver Hoxha's time in power, when Albania was a closed hermit, kind of Stalinist state, to when Albania experienced free market economics and the opening up to the world in the 90s, which in some cases ended disastrously. It was in 1997, the country pretty much had a civil war based on a series of pyramid schemes that went bust. So she kind of uses both kind of this, Stalinist, socialist heritage on one hand and liberal free market economics to kind of interrogate the idea of what it means to be free. So that's what I'm currently
having been
reading.
to Albania, I now look forward to reading that book, so I'll check it out.
Oh, you've been to Albania? Yeah, same here. Albania is a great place. I recommend everyone to go to Albania.
Yeah, very interesting place. Yeah. But what's the next book you're working on?
So the next book I want to write is on early Indian nationalism in general, and it's kind of been in cold storage for a few years. I started to write it during the pandemic, but then I shifted to India, and whenever you take up a new academic job, as you know, you have to stop and you spend a lot of months kind of adjusting and stuff like that. So, but I kind of wanted to be about. So I've written about Naoroji, I've written about one particular figure. I want to now talk about the whole constellation of Indian nationalism and focus on particular themes. So ideas of representation and parliamentary democracy in a place like India. I mean, if you research sources, you realize that even as early as 1859, people are starting to talk about the need for parliamentary democracy in India. That's pretty remarkable, right? I mean, we don't think about that taking place until much later. But there's an editorial in a Calcutta paper where that argument is made right after the Mutiny Rebellion, or ideas of economic revitalization in India, or the role of unusual characters in early Indian nationalism. The figure I did most of my research on and wrote about when I was writing this during the pandemic was Alan Octavian Hume, who's a Scotsman, a Briton, and he founds the Indian National Congress, and he also identifies as an Indian by the end of his life. So that's a really interesting story that I'm trying to include in this book.
And Dinyar, I've enjoyed every minute of our conversation, and I have so many more questions. If we had a whole day to talk, I would keep asking you questions and picking your brain on different things, but we are pressed for time. And so let me thank you for your time today and for sharing your knowledge.
Thank you so much
with us.
Thank you, Vishal. And yeah, it's been a pleasure speaking with you as well. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you, and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.